Randy, before we get started, I just want to welcome everybody to this final session with Randy Woodley. And just want to say, Randy, how grateful we all are for your engagement and your leadership and your brilliant insights. And with that, Randy, I hand it over to you.
Okay, great. So our last night, we put together a Lenten journey from Elohe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice called Drawing Closer to Creator and Creation, an Indigenous Journey Through Lent. And so we thought it might be kind of cool to imagine a different kind of journey to the cross instead of simply based on personal sin, a journey about sort of taking on a new worldview. So anybody can get that by going to our website, elohe.org. And if you sign up to be on our newsletter list, you get sent the Lenten devotional automatically. So eloheh.org. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to get through this rather quickly so that we can have more time to discuss. My impressions are you guys are a pretty intelligent group. You've got a lot of great questions. And so I might go through a little fast, and I added a few things I wouldn't normally add just because I thought there'd be some interest. So let me go ahead. There's elohe.org if you need that. And if you need to email me afterwards, elohe@gmail.com. These are some of my books. Got a new book coming out January 1st is what they're telling me it's coming out. It's called Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of 100 Reflections of Sacred Earth Living. That's what it's called. Yeah. So that'll be out in January. So today, consequences and repair of white supremacy. I want to get to the repair, but I did mention some books last week, and so I wanted to put them up here so you all could have a list in case you didn't get them last week. So these are the four. I said this is sort of like foundational work of what I'm presenting on in these 3 weeks would be especially the Western Worldview and things like that. So whoever interprets history mythologizes and molds society according to their particular worldview. So Winston Churchill said, history will be kind to me. Actually, he said it more like this: history will be kind to me because I intend to write it. And sure enough, he did. And sure enough, it was. And so the winners write history. We've heard that before. But the winners also shape culture and worldview by writing history. Even under the best circumstances, it's often might makes right. So this is what current normative myth of freedom looks like in the U.S. Some of you may know some of these fellows. That's what we call the House Freedom Caucus. Doesn't look like I'd be welcome in that room. So my thesis today is that after 500 years of the Western worldview has not done the earth or the world much good. It's made a few select people very wealthy, but at what cost? And some of these scenes may be familiar. So I want to talk about real quickly because yes, there was genocide on this continent, but that's not it's a much more complex issue than people might first imagine. First of all, and I'm going to go through this part kind of quick. I say there are 3 destructive waves that basically wiped out most of Native America. So for about 150-year period, from about 1125 to 1275, we experienced a number of super droughts in America, what would be America. Some estimate that even as high as 50% of the population of Native Americans were lost. And at the same time, all those things in the first week that I talked about, Chaco Canyon, Cahokia Mounds, Okmulgee Mounds, Effigy Mounds, Gila Cliff Dwellings, Chichen Itza, all of these places emptied during those 150 years. So, so basically people decided that you can't live during these droughts so congested. So urban centers basically became a thing of the past in America at that point. The large cities fell to ruin. And so by the 1300s, most of the Native American cities had all but died out and new patterns began. People split up into smaller groups. So that first destructive pattern, first destructive wave was weather. The second was disease, which about 95% of most tribes were wiped out immediately on contact with European diseases, particularly smallpox. And that would have amounted to about 1/5 of the world's total population at the time, a level of destruction unequaled before or since. We certainly hope that COVID doesn't make it that high. Native Americans succumbed to European pathogens due to lack of exposure and genetic traits that limited Native peoples' ability to deal with unseen killers. Native peoples are free of many genetic diseases, but have a relatively narrow genetic range. American Indians have about 17 human leukocytes, antigens, HLAs, as opposed to Europeans having about 35, a much wider spectrum. HLAs are one of the human body's two main lines of defense against sickness. And these helper T cells are, in the case of Native Americans, oriented predominantly against parasites, but not as focused on bacteria and viruses as are the immune systems of Europeans. So that's why about 90 to 95% of our Native people were wiped out. And because of their clean living standards and lack of exposure to these pathogens that came from medieval Europe, Native people did not develop the resistance and to even childhood diseases such as mumps, measles, chickenpox, or the deadlier vectors like Black Death or smallpox. So because there was daily bathing among Native Americans, and water was, people bathed in the water, drank out of the water in the springs, etc. And so with that bathing, it just spread the pathogens. So entire groups would be decimated by all these diseases, wave after wave. And the mortality rates, like I said, up to 95%. They were from those parts introduced incidentally, though at times with purposeful deliberation, like smallpox blankets. And there's several stories that have been proven that, what we call the first germ warfare. Jeffrey Amherst, a British officer, was the first to introduce smallpox blankets among Native Americans. But the fact that the Indians were dying was celebrated and observed with dispassion and distance. The plagues wreaked havoc on traditional Indian societies. The quote unquote savages most of the colonists saw without ever realizing it were usually the traumatized, destitute survivors of ancient advanced civilizations that had collapsed almost overnight. So the loss was incalculable. So who are these people that our native ancestors met? Christopher Columbus. I'm just going to give you a couple examples. He said, all these lands are densely populated with the best people under the sun. They have neither ill will nor treachery. Amerigo Vespucci said, they don't claim anything as their private property, but have all things in common. They live in harmony without a ruler or authority, for all are like lords. I guess this is American socialism. In the Plymouth colony, William Bradford said, after he found piles and piles of bones and then stockpiles buried of corn and pumpkins and things like this, the whole villages had been wiped out where Plymouth colony was. He said, the good hand of God favored our beginnings by sweeping away great multitudes of the natives that he might make room for us. So it was God's will. The Rogue River War in Oregon, I thought I would bring one of these to you since we're in Oregon. By the way, my wife's fifth great grandfather was in the war against Oregon and Idaho, the Shoshone War, what they call the Snake War. My wife's fifth great grandfather was basically the person responsible to continue to keep the Rogue River War stoked on the Indian side, delivering guns and other things to them. He had a bounty on his head by the state of Oregon. But someone during that time, a white settler, said the Indians are ignorant, abject, and debased by nature, whose minds are as incapable of instruction as their bodies are of labor. They have nothing in common with humanity but the form, and God has sent us to destroy them as he did to the Israelites of old, to similar tribes. So this is a very common kind of quote. They all have that a lot of them have that character to them. And then one Central Oregon settler claimed he had killed over 100 deer in one day. John McLaughlin, who's sometimes referred to as the father of Oregon at Hudson's Bay Company, I've never seen an Indian kill more game than he needed, and I've never seen a white man stop killing while there was still game left to kill. Oregon, like all the other states, enacted the residential boarding school system, whose philosophy was kill the Indian, save the child. The closest one to us in the Willamette Valley would be Chamawa Indian School. And we'd mentioned this, but I wanted to give you this website, the Boarding School Healing Project. boardingschoolhealing.org is a really, really good website made by Native people, committees, and other groups. They have every kind of resource you could imagine there. There are videos, there are curriculum things, there's everything. And if you can go there sometime when you want to look up what happened in Oregon and across the United States and Canada in the boarding schools, that's a really great site. So please write that down and go there and do a little research. Our past Indigenous realities are still our present realities. This is not all in the past. These things are still happening today. They take a different form, of course. A Powhatan chief said in 1620, "Why do you take by force that which we gladly would give in love?" That's the Standing Rock invasion there when they finally decided to move the Indians at Standing Rock. 500 years of observations in Indigenous people and the problems of the Western worldview are obvious to us. The way of life demonstrated by Western peoples leads to alienation from the earth, from others, and from all creation. It creates a false bubble called Western civilization, which the West feels will protect them from calamity. It's built on, like I've mentioned before, age-old philosophy handed down from Greece, Rome, England, and other Western nation states. I want you to note tonight the connection between ethnocide and ecocide. Pretty much, if you have a worldview that sees yourself, your race, as superior to other races, you probably also have a worldview that sees the human person, and especially a white human person, would be superior to creation as well. And the results have been the same: devastation. For Native people, the most pressing result is intergenerational trauma. We have the gravest and most distressing statistics in North America. I wrote a chapter in this book called Poverty and the Poor in the World's Religious Traditions. I wrote the chapter called Poverty and the Poor Among Native American Religious Traditions. It's a really good book. It's a reference book. And you can get all the statistics you want about natives and all of that in there. But there was a strategic plan by both the state and the church. The plan, it was made for planned dependencies, dependent spiritually and physically and economically. And many white American minds were led to believe that indigeneity must continue to be held as either the poor Indian in need of rescue or admired from a distance as vanishing race of noble savages. Some people say our job is to continue to disappear. But question I always pose is, can we be self-empowering, self-sustaining, and even teachers to white American normative society? This ethnic cleansing and genocidal repercussions, I would argue, has repercussions not just for Native people, but for white folks as well. So from post-colonial stress disorder, in which some social scientists will say that all Native people suffer from that, comes post-traumatic stress disorder and intergenerational trauma, which is a very real thing. But if we carry intergenerational trauma, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom that's in our genes and our DNA. So I want to talk just a minute about my project. I usually don't do this, but just so you understand where I'm coming from, my PhD project was to try and find out if this harmony way construct that I knew was among my tribe and a couple other tribes was widespread among Native tribes. And we did find out that I did 45 different tribes in all these areas with dots in the US and Canada. Were represented, all these, so it's basically every region of the United States and Canada, almost, and found out that they all have this, what we call the harmony way construct, very similar to sort of a biblical idea of shalom, especially Walter Brueggemann's understanding of shalom. So I linked elders and surveys, responses with literature regarding Native values, studies, discourse, and experiences, and some categories emerged. I was able to establish among Native Americans a widely held construct referred to generally as the harmony way, then able to deduce and examine 10 core values that exist within that framework of the harmony way, commonly held among 45 tribal groups represented. And of course, I came to find out also that a lot of Indigenous people around the world hold the same values. I integrated the data. And these are the 10 widespread harmony way values among at least 45 Native tribes in the United States and Canada. Academically, we can only say it's widespread, but basically it's almost universal. So, tangible spirituality, life is governed by harmony, community is essential, humor is sacred and necessary, cooperative communality, like consensus gives dignity, high tolerance, etc. Orality, words have primordial power, present and past time orientation as opposed to present and future, which would be most Western folks. Open work ethic, hospitality and generosity, and a natural connectedness to all creation. That's something that most Indigenous people everywhere, I will go ahead and say, have these in common. And if you kind of wanted to reduce them to a very sort of simplistic understanding, it would look something like this: respect, harmony, friendship, laughter, equality, authenticity, history, work-rest balance, generosity, and accountability. So these are actually verifiable values among most Native people, traditional people especially. But I note that we're all Indigenous from somewhere. Everybody's Indigenous originally to a land from somewhere. And I think we still have that kind of collective memory that sometimes we need to get back to. I think these values in this harmony way are the original instructions given to humanity. So some of the problem with the Western worldview, I went over dualism and hierarchy and some of that kind of stuff with you before, but this conquest mentality, conquering attitude toward nature appears to rest on three assumptions: that the universe is mechanistic, that humankind is the master, and that humankind is qualitatively different from all other forms of life. Specifically, American and Western humankind credits themselves with a special inner consciousness, a soul, for which he or she does not give other creatures credit. Traditionally, Native Americans understand all creation to have spirit, soul, life force. In other words, we're panentheistic. So this is a testimony in a congressional hearing in 1978, but he did a good job of explaining this Elohe harmony concept. In the language of my people, there's a word for land, Elohe. That same word also means history, culture, and religion. We cannot separate our place on earth from our lives on the earth, nor from our vision, nor our meaning as a people. We are taught from childhood that the animals and even the trees and plants are our brothers and sisters. So when we speak of land, we are not speaking of property, territory, or even a piece of ground upon which our houses sit and which our crops are grown. We are speaking of something truly sacred. And I think I mentioned before that this is a reconstruction of one of my third great grandfather's villages. So we would believe that human beings are not superior to nor subordinate to the rest of creation, even though many religious people, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, and evolutionists alike, espouse ideas that purport or imply human beings are at the pinnacle of the created order, including reincarnated or evolutionary order. Indigenous creation narratives invariably reveal human beings as a cooperative partner with the rest of creation, participating with creation in an important role, usually as caretakers. Even those creation narratives absent of human beings, and there's lots of those, remind us that creation can exist without us. So, Robert Jensen, a professor in Texas, said that it can be difficult for white Americans to recognize that white supremacy is the rot at the core of the project and always has been. The country's formation, economic expansion, and imperial endeavors are inextricably intertwined with racism. White society's version of U.S. history is weighed down by narcissistic fantasies of innocence, entangled in a self-serving web of stories of nobility. Those denials of the past are critical to those who cannot honestly confront the present. So, one of the things I wonder about is if genocide and mass land theft are left unreconciled, it ensures that no peace in the land is possible. That's my thoughts. Hundreds of indigenous nations suffered a similar fate. The European genocide against Native Americans was planned, calculated, and mythologized like those of Hitler and Stalin. The perceived problem with Indians was because they held land others wanted, yet it was considered by the natives to be the creator's land. Regardless, tens of millions were killed and displaced for it. You and I are direct beneficiaries of this genocide and theft, and we have to consider our forebears and what effect it has on our own sense of well-being and our spirituality. So a quote by a smart Maori woman in New Zealand, she said, problematizing the indigenous is a Western obsession. Concern about the indigenous problem began as an explicitly militaristic or policing concern. Once indigenous peoples had been rounded up and put on reserves, the indigenous problem became a policy of discourse which reached out across all aspects of a government's attempt to control the natives. Both friends of the natives and those hostile to indigenous peoples conceptualized the issues of colonization and European encroachment on indigenous territories in terms of a problem of the natives. The natives were, according to this view, to blame for not accepting the terms of their colonization. The belief in the indigenous problem is still present in the Western psyche. So my friend Adrian Jacobs said this way: as in any recovery from debilitating social cultural problems, the journey begins with, hello, my name is, I have a problem. I am proposing that Aboriginal culture, worldview, frame of reference offers hope to Western peoples. Aboriginal people are not your problem. We are your cure. Adrian also said, we are the conscience of your technology. We are the humanizers of your institutions. We matter quite apart from your recognition of our worth. We are a threat to entrenched powers that be who refuse to open the doors of opportunity and choice to all. We are a challenge to the mindset of greed, calling for the equitable distribution of resources in the spirit of the Jewish year of Jubilee. We are good medicine for you. And I just wanted to mention here, back to Oregon again, I'd mentioned this before. there was a time during the Snake Indian War that men, women, and children, Shoshones, all had scalps or bounties on their heads. And the Idaho governor, Caleb Lyons, said Shoshones make good target practice. But a Shoshone elder said, "Do not begrudge the white man his presence on this land. Though he doesn't know it yet, he has come here to learn from us." So let's look at facing white supremacy. The first reaction might be kill the messenger, later maybe a worldview change. So what happens is it contradicts dominant cultural assumptions of equality, opportunity, individual work ethic, democracy, etc. So it challenges all those. It meets resistance from simplistic Christian reductionist formulas like, if we all just put Jesus first. Brings to the surface hidden prejudices because they have rarely been discussed openly. And people experience fear that if they cave into the premise, they will have no social, theological, or mythological safe haven because the views are clouded by the American myth. Common defense mechanisms to deny and minimize, to blame the victim, to call it something else. It's better the old way. Well, I'm one of the good ones. I'm sick and tired of being PC. It doesn't count if you don't mean it that way when you say those things. Some outcomes in white identity development to understand the social constructs of race and race theory with the implications and purposes they have served in America. That's a good start. To understand the systems of advantages whites have in America and avoid perpetuating personal and systemic racism. To learn the history of white protest against racism and become allies to people of color. There's lots of white folks who put their lives on the line, and we need to honor them. Don't just help victims of racism, but speak up against systems of oppression and challenge other whites to do the same. To understand the many factors that contribute to one's racial identity development, including family, society, politics, history, and how racial identity also influences the quality of an individual's racial group identification. Some more goals. On a personal level, the goal of white identity development is to abandon racism and develop a non-racist white identity. To deconstruct the systems of oppression and racism and reconstruct them resembling justice and equity for all, which I understand is what you good folks are doing. Develop cultural competence in a rapidly changing world. Experience discomfort more often. Develop a better theology of diversity. Become an active ally to disenfranchised peoples and learn from the racial or cultural or sexual other. The stages of development sort of break down like this. Maybe you might find your own self or your own community in one of these places. Contact, unexamined contact with people of color or vicarious contact through the media. Disintegration, that often precipitated by a moral dilemma concerning race that results in cognitive dissonance, like George Floyd's death, for example. Reintegration, conscious acknowledgement of white identity, residual feelings of guilt, and anxiety are transformed into fear and anger toward people of color. Pseudo-independent redefines white identity, understand racism and their role at an intellectual level. Then there's immersion, immersed in developing a positive white identity, focus on educating other whites, and autonomy, internalizing and applying the new definition of whiteness. White racial identity is ongoing and it's cyclical. And here's some basic steps toward shared integration in churches. So intentionality, no longer passive, not just cerebral, but it's actually action you take. Inclusive worship, no longer homogeneous. Racially diverse leadership, sharing power, not tokenism. Adaptability, not rigidness. Humor, which is good medicine, but especially the ability to laugh at our own selves and our own mistakes. So other outcomes for Christians. Develop a theology of diversity and inclusion based on scripture and Jesus view of shalom, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Celebrate the giftedness found within cultures different than white Euro-American based cultures. Rediscover the giftedness of white indigenous cultures. I think that's a really important one, by the way. Understand how particular Western pedagogies perpetuate oppression. So not just content, but the way things are done, the pedagogies continue. One great book to look at is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Learn how Jesus' call to meekness and humility can be implemented on systemic, organizational, and societal levels concerning entitlement and opportunity. Learn the value of humor and laughing at ourselves and our racial identities. Shalom. Of course, I've written a whole book about shalom and the community of creation and indigenous vision, but I'm just going to give you one quick page of it here. God's intended shalom begins with the garden in Genesis. Basically, the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 are basically where shalom is broken. The Old Testament laws, like in the Old Testament prophets, the festivals, the Sabbath year, the Jubilee, the treatment of foreigners, widows, and orphans, and then the whole New Testament, all is about shalom. Shalom's God's preferred state of life for all creation. It's the culture of the Trinity. It's the kingdom Jesus came preaching. It's the mission of the church, and widows and orphans and strangers, the Holy Triad, and others who are the most marginalized and disenfranchised in society tell us whether we are experiencing shalom or not by how they're being treated. Yeah, so I think that's all I'll say about that for right now. We can talk about that. And then I just want to look at this chart. This is the last thing we'll do. This is when people always want to know at the beginning, well, what do we do? I save this till the end because we need to hear some other things first. But this is a new paradigm, I think, that I promote. And when people say, what do we do? Most structurally and individually, here's a way to get started is here. So awareness, an education process led by Indigenous people in their comfort zone. So it's kind of like you go to where they are after COVID's gone. And pay them well. And then I think lament is called for after that. Lament, I call for lament as a confession in the public square, speaking truth to power and allowing time for it to sink in. And then reparations, which is for me, what I believe is the part that really helps white folks, which is the rehumanizing, I call it. Restitution first. Then relationship building, justice initiatives, land initiatives, etc. That Native people are already involved in so many. You just need to jump in and help somewhere. And a lot of people don't like it that I say restitution first, but I say that because after 35 years of experience, what happens is when you build the friendships, nobody feels like there needs to be restitution, and so it's forgotten. And then memorialize, working together. Both Indigenous people and white folks and non-Indigenous people in partnership, retelling this history, codifying the markers, making sure that there's a witness to the future of what has been done together and what has been dealt with. And you may have to go around this circle a number of times in your own community to deal with the things that have happened there. But basically, I think this will help people both structurally and personally to move forward. And when we talk about how do we repair the injury between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And I wanted to end with a story. So I'm going to go back to this for a minute while I'm telling the story, and you can keep looking at that. So the stories of Grandmother Turtle, it's a Cherokee story. And basically what happens is that there was a mountain, we now call it Blue Mountain, but there was a mountain and the water was all the way up almost to the top of Blue Mountain. And the animals were a lot bigger way back then. And so the animals were running out of room. And so they got among themselves, they held a council and said, what do we do? So they went to Creator and they said, Creator, we need more land. And so Creator knew, well, I just can't give them more land because then they won't appreciate it. So if someone would dive down to the bottom of the water and they would get mud and they would bring it back up, I will take that mud and I'll spread it out and I'll create new land. And so they got together and they said, hey, who's going to do it? And so right away, Grandmother Turtle said, I will do it. And they just said, well, Grandmother Turtle, really, let's let someone else do it because you're kind of old and you're kind of slow. So, and so they looked to Mrs. Duck and they said, Mrs. Duck, could you do it? And she said, sure, I can do it. And so she went out and she got out in the water and she dove down and she popped back up again. She dove down again and she popped back up again. And then she did it a third time and she popped back up and she came back a little embarrassed and she said, you know, I'm a lot better at floating than I am at diving. So they said, oh man, who are going to get to do this now? And so Grandmother Turtle right away stepped forward and said, I'll go get the mud. And they said, this time they just sort of ignored her and said, Grandmother Turtle, you know, let's try somebody else. So they looked down the beach and they saw Otter. And Otter's a great diver and a great swimmer. So they said, hey, Otter, would you go down and get the mud for us and bring it back up? And so Otter said, sure, I'll go. And so Otter took off. A day went by, another day went by. And on the third day, they were wondering, you know, what has happened to Otter? And they looked down the beach again. And there he was laying on his back, eating a fish. And they all ran down the beach and they said, hey, Otter, what about the mud? And he said, oh, well, you know, what happened was, you know, I was going to get that mud and then I saw a fish and then it took me a couple of days to chase that fish down and, you know, and I finally caught him. And then what was it I was supposed to get anyway? Oh, they were so frustrated. So they said, we need to find somebody else to do it. Well, Grandmother Turtle once again said, I'm happy to go get the mud. Well, this time they just ignored her and kind of crowded her out. And they looked over and they saw Beaver over there. And they said, hey, Beaver, what about you? And Beaver said, oh, yeah, I'd be perfect. You know, I'm a good swimmer. You know, I don't eat fish, so you don't have to worry there. And you know, I just work all the time. I don't play. I'm not like Otter. So Beaver went out. And sure enough, Beaver's gone for the first day, the second day, the third day. And on the fourth day, Beaver comes back and she can barely make it back in. And she says, there's no way. There's no way that anybody can ever go down and hold their breath that long because, you know, it's just too far down. I almost didn't make it back. And so they were sad and they were standing around. And just then Grandmother Turtle just walks through the middle of them. And she slides down into the water. And they saw that Grandmother Turtle was going to do it. So one day went by, 2 days, a third day, 4 days. Wow. 5 days went by. And on the fifth day, they put Squirrel up in the highest tree to watch for Grandmother Turtle. The sixth day, nothing. But on the seventh day, Squirrel yelled down and said, I see something. And sure enough, it was Grandmother Turtle rising to the top. And she was floating with her legs out and her arms out and her head out and her tail out, floating to the top. And they realized that she was dead. And so Beaver and Otter and Duck all went out and they brought Grandmother Turtle back and they laid her on her back and they were all very sad. They were sad because she was dead, of course. They were sad because they couldn't get more land. They didn't have the mud. It was just a sad experience. And right then someone looked down and said, hey, what's that in Grandmother Turtle's claw? And they looked down. And sure enough, under one claw, there was a ball of mud. And they took that ball of mud and they took it to Creator and said, Creator, we did it. And Grandmother Turtle gave her life to do it. And so Creator said, I'm going to make more land and I'm going to call it Turtle Island in grandmother's turtle's honor. And so Creator took that mud and spread it all over the place. And that's the story. And so when I ask people, what do you learn from that story? They come up with a lot of different things, but it was a 8-year-old Indian boy in elementary school that we were telling this story at who came up with, I think, the best answer. And what he said was, they should have listened to their elder. Grandmother Turtle knew from the beginning. They should have listened to her. And so I tell that story because I have one hope for humanity and Western humans. Native people, after thousands and thousands of years, have figured out how to live on this continent, and they've adapted over the years. They've adapted in a shalom-like way we call the harmony way. And so I believe for us to survive and our children and up to the 7th generation, that they're going to have to take the mud from our hands, the things that we have left, things that we've sacrificed. And the mud is a worldview and indigenous values based on this harmony way and shalom, if we're ever going to make it. And that's why we do what we do.
Thank you, Randy. Yes, terrific. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. If you know how to raise your hand in the chat box, that would be the best way for us to be able to see you.
The question I have is about intergenerational trauma. And in my experience, we lose so many Native people in adolescence and adulthood and before they're even middle-aged. And I think it's as a result of this intergenerational trauma. And, you know, what can be done about it? I mean, every time somebody else dies that you think is going to survive, and then they have this senseless death, like at the age of 33 and leaving behind 5 children, it's like, gosh, what can be done, you know?
Yep, I do know. I pastored a Native community for 7 years. We were the only Native church, and the whole community was our parish, not just the church. So I did 66 funerals in 7 years and did more hospital calls than you can imagine, our home visits, suicide calls and watches. So I know well the tragedies in our Native communities. And so that is a direct result sometimes of intergenerational trauma, but it's also a result of a greater post-colonial stress syndrome. And in that way, the only thing that well, I shouldn't say the only thing, I should say one of the major ways that we see people get help is coming back to our traditions and beginning to participate in our ceremonies. And so we ran a sweat lodge during all that time. And so I've been leading sweat for 30 years, something like that. A lot of people would come to that and receive healing. So, but one of the most damaging things has been the church, especially evangelical churches and Pentecostal churches, to our Native people. Although, you know, I know, especially in Canada, Anglican Church and Roman Catholic Church and a lot of others are also guilty of lots of stuff. So it's like nobody's free of this, right? Somebody always, like, I work for a Quaker institution, and they always say, well, the Quakers did a better job, right, than all the other denominations. And I say, to say the Quakers did a better job isn't saying much, because everybody did a pretty poor job. So, yeah, it's like there's no like fix all. There's lots that needs to be done. We need, you know, quit cutting the funding to our Indian Health Service is one thing that can help immediately. having native recovery programs where our traditions are used. They're very few, and you can't afford to get people in drug treatment or alcohol treatment, most especially drug treatment, though, unless you're extremely wealthy, and most Native people aren't extremely wealthy. So the healthcare problem in our society, anytime you see a problem with the healthcare system, it's exacerbated probably 10 times that in the Indian community. So, the system is not made to work for us. We're the first people who get cut when they start cutting funding, and we've never been fully funded the way that we're supposed to be. So, and that goes for mental health as well, addictions recovery, all of these kinds of things. If we could solve the healthcare problem in this country, that would go a long way.
Thanks, Randy. Alan, how about you?
Hi, thank you, Randy. It's been so enlightening for the last few weeks to really, because I really do not know much about, the history and what happened for the indigenous people. So thank you for that. I just want to make a comment that one of your last slide, when you talk about inviting speakers and pay them well, I cannot say, what a big amen to that. And this happens to all people of color. Very often we use them to do translation, to do all sorts of things, and we expect them to do it for free. And yet we don't expect that for other professionals. One of the very strong, advocate for that was Sandra Montes. She is the Dean of Chapel at Union Theological Seminary. She's Latina. If you follow her Facebook page, she is very fun because she's very vocal about all this very insidious, racist things that we, as a church do. And she always remind people, if you want me to translate your liturgy into Spanish, expect to pay me well and don't do it for free. So I really do appreciate that you bring that to our attention, because this is something that we very often, do within our churches, that we expect people of color to do services for free. So thank you for that. Yeah.
And I'll just say that, the Trinity is paying what we ask, so we don't have any complaints here. So
thank you, Randy. Scott, how about you?
Thank you, Randy. I had a question about the harmony way. It was interesting to me that the similar philosophy was practiced in various groups around this country and in other places also in North America, and that the philosophies were similar. So it was the feeling that there was sometimes some sort of connection between all the various groups, and that it grew up that way, or more that the philosophy just grew up in different places kind of more organically.
Well, I just think that's how we're wired as human beings. So I call it the original instructions. I asked Walter Brueggemann one time, who's a sort of the Old Testament expert on shalom stuff. I told him, about my dissertation. He endorsed my book and stuff, shalom book, but and also my children's book. He wrote the afterword for my children's book. But, so I asked him, I said, after querying, 45 different tribes and tribal groups and regions across the United States and Canada. And then, I've had Maoris and from New Zealand, and Aboriginals from Australia, and Maasai from Kenya, and, Zulu from South Africa, and, Sami from, up in the Scandinavia. And they all say, well, we have those same values, And so Ikalahan, Filipino tribal group in the Philippines. So I'm pretty sure that you develop this harmony way, either, innately or through living, of course, with the land, and the land teaches us it. And so the earth is I always say is the most consistent and ever-present teacher that we'll ever have. And so when you grow up learning from the earth, you develop a way to try and stay in harmony as nature does, I guess. And so that's what I would credit it to. I think God has just put that within us, and the earth is made for that purpose. And you learn by watching nature how to live. So, but if that were to be true, then what does that say about society who tries to block nature out?
I think it's a telling comparison to compare that to a form of spirituality that says the goal of the religious life is to find salvation by believing the correct ideas about God as some abstract object up in the clouds. There's two different, there's probably a lot more than that, but I always think there's a path of spirituality that's about seeking kind of the magic that happens, the healing that happens when loving, just relationships are pursued, and the sacred event that occurs as those relationships are honored and pursued. That's one spirituality. And the other spirituality is believe on the right ideas, think of those ideas and think of them as true. And somehow you, as an individual, are going to have your problem solved.
So we talk about that in the book my friend Bo Sanders and I just wrote called Decolonizing Evangelicalism. And we talk about, this basically a lot of our language is really outdated. And just the word salvation even has come to mean different than the way it's even used in scripture. And so I advocate in most cases just saying the word healing. And healing is continuous, and healing is, by degree. And our salvation is really healing. One of my professors, Howard Snyder, wrote a book called Salvation is Creation Healed, which I really like. And I have to think that me and the native cohort that studied under him had some influence on him. But he laid all this out theologically, and I think it's a really great book.
Thank you. Talmar.
Yes, I'm interested in the process or what's being done to record and save the indigenous language, and whether or not the Oregon Historical Society is a resource for some of that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't know about the OHS. I wouldn't doubt it because they're always doing kind of cool things. But so our native languages were all but wiped out except for the larger tribes. So like the Navajos, 80% of Navajos still speak their language. My particular Cherokee tribe, the United Ketua Band, 60% still, but that's because it's made up of mostly full bloods from a small area. But a lot of people lost their languages completely. Some, like most of the tribes, like the Kalapuyans, for example, we were on Kalapuyan land, and the Kalapuyan language is extinct. And so what they did was they adopted a general Chinookan language, trade language they call Chinook Wawa. And that Chinook Wawa now is what most of the tribes here in our area speak if they're Chinookan. But yeah, it's a really hard thing to come back and try and learn your language after most everyone has forgotten it. It's darn near impossible. They're starting more and more immersion programs in elementary schools, and that's the way it's going to have to be done. And we'll see if that works or not. I tried to learn. I didn't grow up speaking Cherokee, and I tried to learn when I was living in Cherokee country. And I basically, after a couple of years, got to the baby stage, like baby talk. and then I moved and I never used it again. So I lost it. So.
Barb Milliken.
I was just going to respond to that question, because if you go to the website for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. They have a videotape of the elders teaching. They have a preschool where they're teaching the Chinook Wawa to the preschoolers, and it's really great to see that. And all of the tribal or the federally recognized tribes have a website, and most of them have some kind of program or granting where they're trying to work on the language.
Yeah.
I also noticed recently, Randy, I'll have to send it to you. There's a big grant out now for Native American artists. Grant proposals.
Yeah, there's a number of different areas now that they're giving a lot of grants in, artists and craft workers, language, and food sovereignty. Those are just some of the ones that that are out there. We have a volunteer who writes grants for us, and we're able to find a few smaller ones. But most of the food sovereignty and things like that, even though we have our own seed company and go to the larger groups that are applying for this stuff. And so I think we've gotten turned down for, 7 or 8 grants by now.
Thank you. David Mitchell.
Yeah, I have a quick and easy one and one that might take a little longer. The quick and easy, last week, I wrote down that you said to look up dream catchers. Well, you can imagine how that went when I tried to Google it. So
You might put in Dreamcatcher, the movie.
The movie, okay. And a few years back, really with the leadership of a sexton we had at the time, I think Trinity was moving more toward being closer to the land, especially the land that we were on. And some of that has continued, but we don't talk about it as much. And I'm wondering if you would have any ideas of what we can do as a congregation to really get closer to the land.
Yeah. So I don't know what kind of land you have. Do you have any land besides what the church sits on?
There's not much beside what the church sits on. And so some of it got put into permaculture and things like that. But not a lot other than that, no. We can get out to it.
Well, I can only suggest cooperative gardens and things like that if you can find space for them. And then, if you had a big enough land, you can start setting some aside for all the other creatures and things like that. But there's a lot of creative things being done with a lot of sort of millennial churches are the ones that are sort of leading the way in this. Have you ever heard of the guerrilla gardener? Is one urban strategy is to grow food that people can steal when they go by, and so they get healthy food. He was doing it in Watts, and now it's gotten to the thing where basically in his neighborhood, every abandoned field now is people working the land, cooperating together. So there's that kind of a thing. There's ways to do stuff. I know another church that put out like 7 or 8 raised bed boxes in front of the church, and they're growing stuff. You just got to have people who are really interested. You can't sort of say, hey, let's do this. What you have to do is say, who's interested in this? And then let's get together and let it take shape, so.
We had a year ago, a very ambitious weekend retreat planned with an immersion in Forest Park and a Eucharist out there in the woods, and a lot of conversation around spirituality of the earth. And then COVID came along and canceled the whole thing for us. But thank you, David. Yeah, let's keep the conversation going on that. Carolyn, you had your hand up.
Okay, so I was wanting to make a comment about the languages, because when I was in Cheyenne and Crowland, the Crow, which is a huge tribe, of them still speak Crow. There's just lots and lots of fluent speakers of Crow. But the Cheyenne have lost many, many fluent speakers, and it's mostly very elderly people that still have the Cheyenne language. And one of the things they told us is that almost all the Cheyenne were fluent in Cheyenne until the age of television. And then when televisions came onto the reservation, they started losing more of the language for some reason, you know, with kids watching more English TV and stuff. And now very, very few children actually speak Cheyenne. And some of the churches and stuff, they sing hymns in Cheyenne, but not many fluent speakers.
Yeah, and the Crow did this intentionally. The Crow, basically they had two rules. They said that they would not teach their kids English before they went to school because they would learn that in school. And they also said that whenever another Crow comes up to you, you have to speak in Crow. So that they trained themselves to not lose their language. Incidentally, the scene behind me is my backyard.
Oh, wow.
That was last night's sunset.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
I have a real quick question. What do you mean by codifying markers?
Okay, so that's a good question, Doug. I got the idea from, you know, in the Old Testament, a lot of places, then this thing happened and you know, they put up marker stones, memorial stones to remember what happened here and that kind of a thing. But I also think it's an important thing is that when people finally kind of bridge this gap or resolve injustice, that there be something tangible that people can look to and remind them. And I also got the idea because most of the markers across the United States are lies, right? They're based on the winter story and they cut out the other sides of the story. There was a book written about it by, what was his name? James Lowell, Lies Across the United States. He also wrote one called Lies That My Teacher Told Me. James Lowen. And basically, you know, I feel that we need to redo all the markers, and let's just take Oregon, for example, and have committees come together comprised of all the people representing all the people of Oregon and recreate the markers. Those markers basically codify the myths that we believe, and so do the history books. So what we need to do is to codify these healing times and reconciliation times and all this when we really actually do something, so that people will know, hey, there's some stuff that's been done about this and there's some people who've dealt with this, or else 2 generations later, people are going to go, you know, well, whatever happened about this, you know? And I've seen it work. There's a really good film that you all should show, called Two Rivers. And again, you'd have to look up Two Rivers, the movie, because there's a lot of Two Rivers when you Google it. But you can buy that at his independent website. And it's a great movie about what happens up in Twisp, Washington, when a white community says, why are there no Indians here? And yet everything has Indian names. And the story builds. And after about 3 years, they hold public ceremony after these relationships have been built. And then one of the things that came out of this was that the town of Twisp donated a half acre for a culture center for the people whose land had been stolen. And now that culture center tells their stories. Those folks from the tribe are on the board. The people who are sort of behind this are the people who run it. And you can go there and you can see the story, and you can see it online too. If you look up probably Twisp, I'm guessing Twisp, Washington Cultural Center, something like that, maybe. And you can read online the story, part of the story anyway, of what happened. And so that actual place is a marker of reconciliation that occurred between peoples that I think is a really good, I guess the word would be a really good witness that good people came together and did something about tragedy. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Chalmer, you have another question.
Yes, thank you. I know there's the Aztec calendar, and my goddaughter is Chinese, so pretty soon I'll be sending her a Happy New Year for their start of the year. So I'm wondering if the indigenous culture, I don't know whether it's a cosmological question or not, whether or not they have a different way of seeing a new year or of honoring a new year.
So it would be like most indigenous cultures. In fact, your Scandinavian indigenous culture is probably similar in that they would celebrate the winter solstice and summer solstice and, you know, et cetera. So our ceremonies were all based upon the time of year, whether it was planting or harvesting or all those kinds of things. And as you recall from maybe from the first presentation, most all of our ancient native sites had astrological observatories and solstice markers that mark the years. And so, that mark the times of the years. So, so that would be that. Now, the people who sort of are famous for this is the Mayan calendar, right? They have this thing to a fine art. I have a indigenous friend in Peru who's an expert on the Mayan calendar, and they sort of took that to new levels. But most of our people just celebrated by the solstices and things. Yeah, that's what people of the land do, right? They work with the land. Yeah.
And I don't suppose they very often measured the passing of the years 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You didn't have a similar system to,
Right. And there's no one tribal culture. Well, there's regional cultures, but like the Lakota, for example, and other Plains tribes, they kept what they call winter counts. So they kept them on buffalo robes, and and they would pass buffalo robes down, and that would be a historical marker as to like what year. So this was the year that the stars fell from the sky, or the years that So the earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, or whatever it was, and so there's those, and it's an area that probably other people have researched, but I haven't spent that much time. I just know that we celebrated, our markers of the year with our ceremonies. So
it strikes me as more cyclical than linear, for sure.
Very much. It'd be like the new moon of such and such is when we do this festival, and all that. So,
Barb?
So I guess I share this at another meeting this week, but there's a really good book called The First Oregonians. And it talks about the Oregonians that were here thousands of years ago, not so much the recent tribes, but they have something in here that they describe as seasonal rounds. So at different times, and there's a beautiful, you wouldn't be able to see it up close, but I can take a picture of it. But it just talks about, here, it's a circle. I don't know if you guys can see that at all, but it's really described by what people hunting and gathering food. And one of the most interesting places I've ever been to in Oregon is one of the state parks that's at Cape Perpetua. And they have a whole history piece there about the Alsea Indians who migrated. They were one of the earlier tribes, and where they went from the ocean into the forest. And what's cool about that is you can, you're on the coast and you see the ocean, and you can actually go back into the forest. So you kind of get a feel for the possibility of their lifestyle. But
yeah,
this book, The First Oregonians, is really a treasure that the Oregon Humane Society has published with a variety of authors.
Historical Society, right?
No, not the Historical Society, the Oregon Council for the Humanities.
Oh, humanities. Okay.
And they're affiliated with
Humane
the
Society.
National Endowment for the Arts. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, where's Cape Perpetua at? you know, I've only been here like 13 years in Oregon, so.
Cape Perpetua is near the Heceta Lighthouse. It's close, rather close to the Heceta Head Lighthouse, if you know where that is. It's kind of down the, it's south of Newport. That's the best I can tell you because I don't remember right off the top of my head, but it was one spring break when we jumped in the van and went down the coast.
Sounds like a good idea.
It was.
I'm ready to go.
The chat.
Could you comment on what is involved in becoming a member of a tribe? You know, you have to prove a certain amount of blood from your ancestors, and sometimes that becomes a very controversial subject. I mean, you know,
Extremely.
yeah. Mhm.
So it's interesting. The colonial government is the one who tells the tribes that they're sovereign and tells them what ways they're sovereign, which is an interesting catch-22 situation, right? And then they dictate what the tribe does to call themselves a tribal member. So in most tribes, you have to be a quarter blood. And then, of course, the idea is planned obsolescence, right? Is that eventually you will marry outside of the tribe and your blood will become thinner and you're no longer a member of the tribe. There's a few exceptions to those around, but not many. And those tribes are the federally recognized tribes. And I think I might have mentioned that there's at least as many, there's like 573, I think, federally recognized tribes now, but there's at least that many non-federally recognized tribes around. Yeah, we did talk about that. Yeah, and then, so now with tribes getting casinos, some tribes are like trying to write other people off the rolls because they don't want to share the money, and it's a mess. The whole thing is a mess. And it comes from that system of pedigree through the English, right? You have to marry a royal family member, so you end up marrying your fourth cousin, and then there's this obsession with pedigreed horses and pedigreed dogs and all of those kinds of things, and which to me, for the English, of course, if you know English history, they're a very amalgamated people. And I think it's an overcompensation that it's part of their makeup is an overcompensation, but that's just my opinion. So
it almost starts to sound like eugenics, and and then now we've got
crazy.
the whole DNA thing, right? Elizabeth Warren pulling out her 24 her
yeah,
genetic,
but that doesn't matter in terms of tribal, because now the tribes will say you had to have a relative on the rolls, their government rolls that enrolled them at a certain date, like 1906 Dawes roll, for example, or 18 something Baker roll, or and so so even if you could prove you had the DNA, it wouldn't matter. You have to be on particular rolls. So yeah, it's a very kind of clubbish thing almost.
Yeah, with money and status at stake for some. Scott.
Can you let me screen share, Matthew? I wanted to just show something.
We've had a little trouble with that in recent days, but I think you're pretty trustworthy. So yeah, let me see if I can do that.
So I grew up out in Eastern Oregon, and this is one of a series of rock paintings that are not accessible. I mean, nobody knows that they're there. They're just things that are sort of passed down through our family. And I've always absolutely loved being there. It's a very wonderful space. And these particular markings or drawings are fascinating to me also. So I was just putting those up mostly for comment.
Yeah, they probably date back to my wife's people, the Shoshones.
Yeah, most of the folks around there seem to be sort of what they call Northern Paiutes, or
Yeah, there's a whole lot of people that say the Northern Paiutes and Shoshones are almost the same people, and so we're constantly confused. Most of your maps will say that Eastern Oregon is Northern Paiute, but in fact it was both mixed throughout the whole place, Shoshone and Paiute. So especially the Blue Mountains and the Ochiko Mountains were the headquarters of the Shoshone and a lot of their myths and things like that. But yeah, so yeah, interesting. I don't know what any of those mean, but
Who would be able to help me with that?
somebody probably at the University of Oregon out there in Eastern Oregon. I call the archaeology department maybe to start, or maybe anthropology probably to start. Yeah.
Thanks, Scott.
I and my brother inherited some land from my father, which is up in Gilliam County, on 30 Mile Creek, that just drains into, flows into the John Day. But we have some Indian markings like that, petrographs in a canyon that feeds into 30 Mile Creek. It's called Cave Canyon. In fact, there's these caves in there. And they look quite similar to that, Scott. So
Could I add to that?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Carol. Yeah.
Those drawings that Scott showed, they look very similar to the drawings on Pictograph Cave, which are outside of Billings, Montana, which is considered a benchmark of American archaeology. And the one in particular sort of showed a round figure, which in the Pictograph Caves are called shield warriors, and they predate European contact and predate the horse because they had shields that covered mostly the whole body, as opposed to when they got horses, then they had the smaller shields that they could ride on horseback. So it looks, and they look to be paintings, not pecked in, not in the rock, but they look to be painted on the rock, which is what they are in Pictograph Cave as well.
So back to Doug's note, there's some settler accounts that I've read of Oregon Trail and the John Day River there by outside of Bend, be northwest of Bend, was full for miles of Shoshone teepees. That was one of the places where they had villages at certain times of the year. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for this wonderful series, and especially, of course, Randy, for beautiful leadership and presentations. And thank you all for your wonderful questions too. Beautiful. You all have Randy's website information, so if you have any further questions for him, I imagine he might be able to correspond by email once in a while. And Randy, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. It was really, really valuable.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, and I don't usually get to do 3 weeks in a row, so it's kind of fun because people get more invested in it. So I appreciated all your dialogue and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you,
Hopefully
Randy.
we'll meet again.
It was great.
Okay, take care.